Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the extraordinary social resilience and, let's say, masterful conflict resolution of the Viking communities who lived together peacefully through months of freezing darkness. Before you settle in completely, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's talk about something that most people never really think about: winter. Not just any winter, but the kind of winter that would make a modern person call in sick to life and hide under a blanket for 4 months straight. See, when we imagine Vikings, we usually picture them sailing around in longboats, raiding monasteries, or sitting around fires telling stories about Thor. What we don't often consider is how they managed to survive winters that were frankly ridiculous. And I mean that in the most technical sense. Winters so extreme that they bordered on the absurd. Some Vikings, the ones who ventured far enough north, dealt with something called polar night. This isn't just a long winter evening. This is the sun going down in October and essentially saying, "See you in February, good luck with that." For months, actual months. Now you might think, well, that sounds unpleasant but manageable. People have flashlights, right? Except, of course, they didn't know flashlights, no electric heaters, no grocery stores, no calling for help if things went wrong. Just whatever they had managed to prepare, plus whatever they could figure out along the way. The temperature during these months wasn't just cold. It was the sort of cold that turns your breath into ice crystals before it leaves your face. The kind of cold where you learn very quickly not to touch metal with bare skin unless you're particularly attached to that skin and want to keep it where it is. We're talking about temperatures that could kill you in the time it takes to walk from your house to your neighbor's, assuming you could find your neighbor's house in the dark. And yet somehow these people not only survived but actually seemed to do quite well. They raised children, crafted tools, told stories, and generally carried on with life as if living in a freezer for a third of the year was perfectly normal, which for them it was. The thing is, they had figured out some things that took the rest of the world a surprisingly long time to learn. Simple things mostly, but simple in the way that a good joke is simple. Easy to understand once you hear it, but remarkably difficult to come up with on your own. Take fire, for instance. Everyone knows fire is important when it's cold. Build a fire, stay warm, problem solved. Except when your fuel has to last for 4 months. And gathering more fuel means venturing out into conditions that could kill you. And your fire going out at the wrong time means your entire family might not see spring. Suddenly fire becomes less about warmth and more about engineering, which it turns out the Vikings were surprisingly good at. Or food. Everyone needs to eat, obviously. But when there's no grocery store, no delivery service, and no possibility of hunting or gathering for months at a time, feeding a family becomes a puzzle with very high stakes. Get it wrong, and people starve. Get it right, and you might even put on weight during the winter months, which oddly enough some Vikings managed to do. But perhaps most interesting of all was how they handled the mental side of things. Because here's the thing about living in darkness for months. It does things to your mind. Not good things, generally. Modern science has a term for it, seasonal affective disorder, and we treat it with special lights and sometimes medication. The Vikings didn't have special lights, they didn't have medication. What they had was an understanding of human nature that was, in its own way, quite sophisticated. They understood that surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm and fed, it was about staying sane, staying connected to other people, and maintaining hope that spring would eventually return, which, when you think about it, required a certain amount of faith. After all, if you'd never experienced anything but polar night, how would you know that the sun was supposed to come back? The solutions they developed were practical, efficient, and sometimes surprisingly clever. Not all of them would make sense to us today, and some of them might seem a bit extreme. But they worked. And they worked so well that when European explorers started venturing into the Arctic centuries later, they often died attempting journeys that Vikings had been making routinely for generations. These weren't just tough people who gritted their teeth and endured hardship. They were innovative people who looked at impossible conditions and figured out ways to make them work, sometimes even ways to make them pleasant. So as you get comfortable tonight, let's explore how they did it, starting with something that might surprise you about how they thought about winter itself. The first thing to understand about Vikings who lived in the far north is that they didn't think about winter the way most people do. We tend to see winter as something that happens to us, an inconvenience to endure until spring arrives and life can return to normal. The Arctic Vikings saw winter as something entirely different. They saw it as a season of possibility. This wasn't just positive thinking or making the best of a bad situation. It was a fundamental shift in how they organized their entire year. Summer was for traveling, raiding, trading, and gathering resources. Winter was for everything else: creating, planning, learning, bonding, and preparing for the next cycle. In many ways, winter was when the real life of the community happened. But this mindset didn't develop overnight, and it certainly wasn't easy to maintain. When you haven't seen the sun for 6 weeks and you've got another 6 weeks to go, maintaining optimism requires more than just willpower. It requires structure, community, and some very clever psychological tricks that the Vikings stumbled upon through generations of trial and error. The most important of these tricks was something they probably didn't even realize they were doing. They turned winter into a series of projects. Not busy work or artificial goals, but genuine, necessary tasks that had clear beginning, middle, and end points. Tasks that produced something useful and gave people a sense of progress and accomplishment during months when the outside world remained frustratingly static. Take tool making, for example. During the summer months, Viking men were often away from home for weeks or months at a time, trading, raiding, exploring, or working other people's land. Tools got used hard and often broke or wore out, but there wasn't time to properly repair or replace them when there were ships to sail and crops to tend. Winter was when the broken axe handles got replaced, when dull blades got resharpened and retempered, when new tools were crafted from materials gathered during the warmer months. This wasn't just maintenance, it was innovation. Long winter nights gave craftsmen time to experiment with new designs, try different techniques, and perfect methods that would make the next year more efficient. Women had their own winter projects, equally important and equally engaging. Spinning, weaving, and sewing weren't just chores to pass the time. They were complex skills that required constant learning and improvement. A woman who could weave warm, waterproof cloth wasn't just keeping her family comfortable, she was keeping them alive. And the difference between adequate cloth and excellent cloth could mean the difference between a family that struggled through winter and a family that thrived. But the real genius of these winter projects was that they were social. Families didn't sit alone in the dark, working on individual tasks. They gathered together, often with neighbors, an extended family, turning necessary work into community events. An evening of tool sharpening became an opportunity for men to share techniques, tell stories, and maintain relationships that would be crucial during the busy summer months. Similarly, women's work became a time for sharing knowledge, discussing family matters, and passing down skills from older to younger generations. Children learned by watching and gradually participating, absorbing not just technical skills but cultural values and community history. The stories told during these long working sessions weren't just entertainment, they were education, cultural preservation, and psychological survival, all rolled into one. Epic sagas about heroic ancestors served multiple purposes. They taught moral lessons about courage, loyalty, and perseverance. They preserved historical knowledge about family lineages and important events. And they provided mental escape from the immediate reality of cold, darkness, and confinement. But, perhaps most importantly, these stories reminded people that they were part of something larger than their current situation. The heroes in the sagas had also faced difficult winters, dangerous journeys, and seemingly impossible challenges, and they had survived, thrived, and become worthy of remembrance. The message was clear: if they could do it, so can we. This storytelling tradition also served a practical purpose that modern psychologists would recognize. The stories created what we might call mental time travel. When you're stuck in the dark with no clear sense of how much winter remains, it's easy to feel trapped in an eternal present. But stories about the past and future adventures helped people maintain a sense that time was still moving, that the current situation was temporary, and that better days would come. The Vikings also understood something about human attention spans that we're only now rediscovering. They knew that people can't focus intensely on difficult or tedious tasks for extended periods without burning out, so they built variety into their winter routines. Not just different types of work, but different rhythms and intensities throughout each day and each week. Some tasks required intense concentration and skill. Forging a blade or weaving a complex pattern demanded full attention and couldn't be rushed. Other tasks were more meditative and could be done while talking or listening to stories. Spinning wool, carving simple tools, or preparing food allowed the mind to wander while the hands stayed busy. And then there were purely social activities that served no productive purpose except maintaining morale and community bonds. Games, riddles, singing, and informal competitions that broke up the routine and gave people something to look forward to. These weren't frivolous luxuries. They were essential maintenance for mental health and social cohesion. The Vikings had discovered, without ever calling it by name, that surviving extreme conditions requires more than just physical resources. It requires psychological resources, social resources, and spiritual resources, and those resources, unlike food or fuel, don't get used up when you consume them. They actually grow stronger with use. But all of this community activity required one fundamental thing that the Vikings had to master before any of their other winter survival strategies could work. They had to create spaces where people could actually survive being together for months at a time. So here's something that'll blow your mind. Try to imagine living with your entire extended family, plus maybe a few neighbors, in what's basically a large shed for 4 months straight. No privacy, no personal space, no stepping outside for a breather when Uncle Eric starts telling that same story about the giant fish for the 100th time. Sounds like a recipe for someone getting murdered with a butter knife, right? But somehow the Vikings figured out how to make this work. And I mean really work, not just survive it. They actually created living situations where people got along, stayed productive, and maybe even enjoyed themselves during these months of forced togetherness. The secret wasn't just about building bigger houses or having really patient personalities. It was about understanding something pretty sophisticated about human behavior and space. See, the Vikings realized that the same longhouse that felt spacious and comfortable during summer became a completely different animal in winter. Suddenly you had to fit not just people but animals, tons of stored food, fuel supplies, and all the work activities that kept everyone alive. Oh, and everyone had to stay inside basically all the time. Most people would just cram everyone together and hope for the best. But the Vikings, they turned their winter longhouses into these carefully engineered social machines. Every area had a specific purpose, and everyone knew exactly how to use each space without driving their neighbors completely insane. The centerpiece of the whole setup was the hearth, but calling it a fireplace doesn't really do it justice. This thing was more like the engine of the entire house. The Vikings had figured out how to design these central fire systems that didn't just provide heat. They were like the hub that everything else revolved around. And here's where it gets clever. They lined these hearths with stones that would soak up heat during the day and keep radiating warmth all night long. So even when you banked the fire down to save fuel, these stones kept everyone from freezing. It was like having a medieval heat battery right in the middle of your house. Now you might be thinking, well, that sounds nice, but what about all the smoke? And yeah, there was smoke, lots of it. The rafters were black with the stuff, and I'm sure everyone's lungs weren't exactly pristine by spring. But here's the thing, the Vikings turned this apparent problem into a feature. All that smoke, it was basically preserving their meat and fish that hung from the ceiling. It also kept bugs and rodents away, which is no small thing when your food has to last for months. The sleeping arrangements were where the Vikings really showed their genius for social engineering. They built these raised platforms around the walls, kind of like permanent camping areas. But the positioning wasn't random. Families weren't just plopped down anywhere. There was a whole system to it. Children slept between adults, not just for warmth, but so the grown-ups could keep an eye on them. The elderly got the spots closest to the fire, where they'd stay warmest, and where everyone could benefit from their experience and wisdom. Young adults often got the spots toward the edges, where they could get up during the night to tend fires or check on animals without waking up half the house. But the really brilliant part was how they managed different activities in the same space. You know how in a modern house, you've got separate rooms for sleeping, cooking, working, and hanging out? Well, the Vikings had to do all of that in one big room. And somehow, they made it work without everyone constantly getting in each other's way. They basically created invisible zones. The area right around the hearth was prime real estate. That's where you did anything that needed good light and warmth. Cooking, detailed craft work, taking care of sick people. Move a bit further out and you hit the general activity areas where people worked on everyday tasks, told stories, played games. Further out still were the sleeping areas and storage spots. And here's what's really impressive. Everyone just knew these rules without anyone having to post signs or hold meetings about it. You didn't hog the best spots by the fire unless it was genuinely your turn. You kept your stuff organized and didn't spread into other families' areas. You took your turn at the unpleasant jobs like emptying chamber pots or mucking out the animal areas. The social rules were just as important as the physical layout. Because think about it, you've got people living closer together than most of us would tolerate for a weekend, and they're doing it for months. Every little annoying habit becomes magnified. That person who clears their throat constantly, or who never cleans up after themselves, or who dominates every conversation. After a few weeks of winter confinement, these people could drive you absolutely crazy. So the Vikings developed these subtle but effective ways to keep the peace. Gentle humor was huge. If someone was being annoying, others might make light jokes about it or tell pointed stories that got the message across without direct confrontation. Nobody had to have an awkward conversation about personal habits, but the problematic behavior usually got corrected. They also had this understanding that everyone was going to get on everyone else's nerves sometimes, and that was just normal. The goal wasn't for everyone to be best friends all the time. The goal was for everyone to function together effectively. You didn't have to like Uncle Eric's fish stories, but you did have to listen politely and not start a family feud over it. What's amazing is that this system actually worked. We know from archaeological evidence that these communities didn't just survive these intense living situations, they thrived. People stayed healthy, kept working on complex projects, and even had babies during winter months, which suggests they were optimistic about the future, even during the darkest times. The longhouse wasn't just shelter, it was like this carefully designed social ecosystem that transformed what should have been a nightmare of overcrowding and conflict into something that actually brought communities closer together. But here's the thing, none of this would have worked without one absolutely critical element that the Vikings had to master first: fire. Not just any fire, but fire management that was so sophisticated, it was basically an art form. You see, when most of us think about Viking fires, we probably picture someone throwing logs on a pile and hoping for the best. But fire management in Arctic conditions, that was like conducting a symphony. Every piece of fuel, every breath of air, every hour of the day and night had to be planned and coordinated. Because a mistake didn't just mean being uncomfortable, it meant people died. The Vikings, who figured out how to survive those long winters, understood that fire wasn't just about making flames. It was chemistry, physics, and psychology all rolled into one. They had to become experts in heat transfer, air circulation, and fuel efficiency, all without any of the fancy tools or scientific knowledge we take for granted. So let's start with the biggest challenge: fuel. You might think, well, they just burned wood, right? And sure, wood was used when they could get it, but in the far north, trees were often scarce. The wood that existed was frequently too green, too wet, or too precious to just toss on a fire whenever you felt chilly. So these resourceful people became experts at finding and using fuel sources that most of us would never even consider. Animal fat, for instance, was like gold to them. But not just any animal fat, they knew exactly which types worked best and how to prepare them. Seal oil burned clean and hot with minimal smoke. Whale oil, when they could get their hands on it, was even better. They'd burn these oils in simple stone lamps that could provide both heat and light while using surprisingly little fuel. We're talking about a few tablespoons of oil burning steadily for hours, but oils were precious and had to be saved for the worst conditions. For everyday heating, they became masters of what you might call garbage fuel. Dried animal dung burns surprisingly well when it's properly prepared. Peat cut from bogs during summer provided slow, steady heat. In desperate times, even bones could be burned for warmth. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The Vikings didn't just build one fire and keep feeding it all day and night. They created what was basically a heating system with multiple components all working together. The central hearth was the heart of it, but it wasn't meant to burn hot constantly. During the day, when people were moving around and generating their own body heat, they kept the central fire at a moderate level. Just enough for light and cooking, but not so much that it wasted fuel or made the place uncomfortably warm. But as evening approached and temperatures dropped, they'd start this process they called banking the fire. Banking a fire properly was an art that took years to master. The goal was to arrange the fuel and coals so the fire would burn slowly and steadily all night without anyone having to get up constantly to tend it. And let me tell you, getting this wrong could be a matter of life and death. The process started with creating a deep bed of coals from hardwood or bone. These coals were like the foundation. They provided steady heat that could last for hours. On top of these coals, they carefully arranged larger pieces of fuel in specific patterns that controlled how much air got to the fire. Too much air and everything burned too fast. Too little and the fire would die out completely. The real trick was the final step, covering the whole thing with a layer of ash and small debris that acted like a blanket. This covering slowed down the burning process dramatically. A properly banked fire could burn steadily for 8 to 10 hours, while using only a fraction of the fuel that an open fire would gobble up. When morning came, you just had to stir the coals and add some fresh air to get a good flame going again. But even the most carefully banked fire could fail, and in Arctic conditions, letting your fire die completely was basically a death sentence. So the Vikings developed backup systems to make sure they always had access to flame, even in the worst situations. Hot stones were one backup. They'd place large rocks near the fire during the day, and these stones would absorb incredible amounts of heat. Wrap one of these heated stones in leather or cloth, and you could move it to sleeping areas for hours of localized warmth. Plus, a stone that was hot enough could actually ignite tinder, even without an existing flame. But the cleverest backup was something survival experts today call a punk log. The Vikings would take a piece of partially rotted wood and get it smouldering very slowly in a protected corner of the longhouse. This log wouldn't produce much heat or light, but it would keep a tiny ember going for days or even weeks. If the main fire went out completely, this smouldering log could restart it quickly. Managing all these different heat sources took constant attention, but it wasn't constant work. Different family members would take turns monitoring the fires, adjusting fuel levels, and keeping everything burning at the right rate. Kids learned these skills early, starting with simple jobs like gathering kindling, and gradually taking on more responsibility as they proved they could handle it. The thing is, fire management wasn't just about the technical stuff, it was also about understanding how heat moved through the longhouse and figuring out how to direct that heat where it was needed most. The Vikings became experts at using the natural way the heat flows to their advantage. They knew that warm air rises and cold air sinks, so they positioned sleeping areas and workspaces to take advantage of heat circulation. They used hanging cloth and temporary barriers to guide warm air toward specific spots, or create pockets of warmth around people who were sick or elderly. They also learned to time their heat-intensive activities to match the natural rhythms of the fire. Cooking usually happened when the fire was burning hottest, typically in the evening when fresh fuel had been added. Metalworking and other crafts that needed intense heat were scheduled for times when they could build up the fire without wasting fuel. But maybe most importantly, the Vikings understood that fire management was everyone's responsibility. Everyone in the longhouse had to know the basics, because anyone might need to take over in an emergency. Someone who fell asleep on fire watch or who didn't understand how to properly bank coals could put everyone in danger. This shared responsibility created a culture where fire safety was naturally everyone's concern. People would casually monitor each other's techniques, offering tips and corrections when needed, not in a critical way, but because everyone understood that their survival depended on everyone else being competent. And you know what? The psychological aspect was just as important as the technical side. A well-maintained fire provided way more than just heat and light. It gave people comfort, security, and a sense of control in an environment that was otherwise pretty hostile. The steady glow of banked coals gave people something warm and familiar to focus on during the darkest hours. The daily routines of fire tending provided structure and purpose to days that might otherwise feel endless. But even the most sophisticated fire management couldn't solve every challenge these people faced. They still had to eat, and keeping an entire community properly fed for months, using only what they'd managed to gather and preserve during the brief warm season, well, that required some truly remarkable innovations. Okay, so picture this scenario. You've got to feed your entire family, and maybe some neighbors too, for 4 solid months, using only what you managed to gather, hunt, or grow during the few warm months of the year. No grocery stores, no delivery trucks, no calling up your buddy who's got extra food. Just whatever you were smart enough to put away before winter hit. And here's the kicker. It's not just about having enough calories to keep people alive. You've got to keep everyone healthy, in good spirits, and actually enjoying their meals. Because let me tell you, nothing destroys morale faster than months of eating bland, terrible food. When you're stuck in a dark, cramped space for half the year, a good meal might be the difference between keeping your sanity and completely losing it. So how did the Vikings pull this off? Well, they basically became biochemists without ever knowing that's what they were doing. They figured out fermentation, dehydration, and natural preservation techniques that are honestly pretty sophisticated even by today's standards. The thing that's really clever about their approach is that they didn't just try to prevent food from spoiling. They actually learned to encourage certain kinds of spoilage, the good kinds that make food better, instead of making it dangerous. It sounds weird, but stick with me here. You know how cheese is basically controlled spoilage? Or how wine is just grapes that have been encouraged to decompose in exactly the right way? The Vikings figured out similar principles. They learned that certain bacteria and chemical changes could actually improve food, making it more nutritious, more digestible, or more flavorful. Take their fermented fish, for example. Now, I know what you're thinking. Fermented fish sounds absolutely disgusting, and honestly, by modern standards, it probably was pretty intense. But here's what they discovered. If you bury whole fish in pits lined with birch bark and cover them with stones and dirt, they'll ferment slowly over several months. The process breaks down proteins and fats in ways that make them easier to digest. Plus, it creates nutrients that would be impossible to get otherwise during winter. The fermentation also preserved the fish indefinitely, which was crucial when your fishing season was limited to a few months. And while the taste was probably an acquired one, it provided essential vitamins that prevented scurvy and other nutritional diseases. Pretty smart for people who didn't know what vitamins were, right? But fermentation was just one tool in their toolkit. They also became absolute masters of smoking. And I don't mean just hanging some meat over a fire and hoping for the best. These people turned smoking into an art form. They built specialized smoking structures and learned to control every aspect of the process. The type of wood, the temperature, how long to smoke different foods. Different woods gave different flavors and preservation qualities. Juniper had natural antimicrobial properties that helped prevent spoilage while adding this distinctive taste. Birch created a different flavor while also contributing preservative compounds. The smoking process itself was carefully timed. Light smoking for foods that would be eaten within a few weeks. Heavy smoking for stuff that needed to last months. They controlled the temperature by adjusting how far the food was from the fire and managing airflow through their smoking structures. Now here's something really clever. They figured out how to use the Arctic environment itself as a preservation tool. Instead of just seeing the extreme cold as something to survive, they learned to exploit it. Natural freezing could preserve food indefinitely, but only if you did it right. They dig these pits below the frost line and line them with stones and wood. Food stored in these underground caches would freeze solid and stay frozen all winter. Basically, natural freezers that didn't need any fuel or maintenance. But they had to know exactly how deep to dig, how to prevent moisture from creating damaging ice crystals, and how to organize everything so they could get to the stuff they needed first without disturbing the whole cache. They also discovered that some foods actually got better after being frozen and thawed repeatedly. Certain roots and vegetables became sweeter and more digestible. So they learned to control this process using natural temperature fluctuations to improve foods rather than just preserve them. Fat preservation was another area where they really showed their innovation. Animal fats weren't just calories, they were preservation mediums. You could seal meat in rendered fat, creating an oxygen-free environment that prevented spoilage. Vegetables could be mixed with fat and packed into containers, creating these preserved mixtures that provided both calories and vitamins throughout winter. But here's what's really impressive. They understood that different animals produced fats with different properties. Seal fat, bear fat, domestic animal fats. They all had different melting points and preservation qualities. The Vikings learned exactly how to process each type and what to use them for. The whole system required incredible planning and timing. The work started in late spring when the first foods became available and continued throughout summer and fall. Every week brought different foods that had to be processed in specific ways. Miss the optimal time for any particular preservation activity, and you could be looking at malnutrition or starvation later. Families developed these detailed schedules that coordinated food gathering with preservation work. When fish were running, everyone focused on catching and smoking as many as possible. When berries ripened, all attention shifted to gathering and fermenting. When animals were hunted, everything became about butchering and rendering fat. It was like this carefully choreographed dance where everyone knew their role and timing. Storage was just as sophisticated as the preservation methods. Different foods needed different conditions, and the Vikings created these microenvironments within their storage areas. Smoked meats needed to stay dry and well ventilated. Fermented foods needed stable, cool temperatures. Frozen foods had to stay frozen without developing ice crystals that would ruin the texture. They made storage containers from materials that worked with the preservation method. Birch bark containers had natural antimicrobial properties. Clay vessels could be sealed airtight. Wooden containers could be designed to allow just the right amount of airflow. But you know what I think is the most remarkable thing about their food preservation? They didn't just focus on keeping food safe and nutritious. They cared about keeping it enjoyable. These weren't just survival rations, they were foods that people actually wanted to eat. A well-preserved feast could transform a bleak winter evening into a celebration. It reminded people of the abundance of warmer times and gave them hope that good times would come again. The variety and quality of preserved foods became a source of pride and a way of showing care for family and community. Food preparation and sharing stayed social activities even when fresh ingredients were impossible to get. People would gather around the hearth to prepare meals together, sharing techniques and stories. Mealtimes remained important social events that brought everyone together and maintained cultural traditions. And here's something that shows how sophisticated their thinking was. They understood that surviving winter wasn't just about staying alive, it was about staying human, maintaining the social and cultural aspects of eating that made life worth living, even during the darkest months. So when you think about it, these preservation techniques weren't just about food storage, they were about preserving community, culture, and hope itself. Because surviving those long Arctic nights required more than just calories. It required maintaining the human connections and spiritual nourishment that made all the physical hardship worthwhile. Speaking of staying human during impossible conditions, that brings us to maybe the most challenging aspect of Arctic winter survival, the mental game. Because here's the thing, nobody talks about when they discuss survival techniques, keeping a group of people sane and functioning when they're trapped together in a small space for months, dealing with constant stress and the knowledge that any serious mistake could be fatal. The Vikings understood something that modern psychology has terms for, but that they just knew instinctively. Cabin fever, seasonal depression, social tension, these weren't just minor inconveniences. They were serious threats that could destroy a community just as effectively as running out of food or fuel. You know what's really smart about how they handled this? They didn't just hope everyone would tough it out and get along, they created structure where none existed naturally. See, winter completely disrupted the normal rhythms of life. No crops to tend, no ships to sail, no regular activities to mark the passage of time. When the sun stops rising and setting in any meaningful way, time becomes this shapeless, disorienting thing. So the Vikings imposed artificial structure on this chaos. They created daily routines that gave people predictable activities and clear expectations. Morning might start with fire tending and a shared meal. Midday could be for specific work or crafts. Evening was for stories, games, social time. These weren't rigid schedules, but they provided enough structure to give people a sense of progress and purpose. The work assignments were particularly clever. Instead of having everyone do the same boring tasks all the time, they rotated responsibilities. You might spend a few days working on leather crafts, then switch to food prep, then move on to tool maintenance. This kept people engaged and prevented that mind-numbing boredom that comes from repetitive work. Plus, it created a more resilient community where everyone could handle multiple types of necessary jobs. But the real genius was in how they managed conflict. Because let's be honest, conflict was going to happen. Put any group of people in a confined space for months, add stress and uncertainty, and interpersonal problems are inevitable. The question wasn't whether conflicts would arise, but how to handle them when they did. They developed what you might call a graduated response system. Minor irritations got handled through humor and gentle social pressure. If someone was hogging conversations or slacking on their work, others might make jokes or tell pointed stories that got the message across without direct confrontation. This let people correct their behavior without losing face, which was crucial when everyone had to keep living and working together. For more serious problems, they had respected community members who could mediate and suggest solutions. The focus was always on finding ways for everyone to continue functioning as part of the group, rather than determining winners and losers. When punishment was necessary, it was designed to reinforce community bonds rather than exclude people. But the most sophisticated part was their understanding of prevention. They recognized that many social problems came from stress, boredom, or feeling unvalued. So they developed proactive strategies to address these underlying causes before they could turn into serious conflicts. Storytelling was huge for this. Those epic sagas weren't just entertainment. They were moral education that reinforced community values, provided models for handling difficult situations. Stories about heroes overcoming impossible odds reminded people that their current challenges were temporary. Stories about the consequences of betrayal or selfishness reinforced social expectations without directly criticizing anyone. The stories also gave people an outlet for emotions that might not have any other healthy expression. You could identify with characters, experience triumph and tragedy vicariously, discuss moral implications in a safe context. It was like therapy disguised as entertainment. Games served similar functions: physical competitions, board games, riddles, contests. These provided structured ways for people to compete and show off without the stakes getting dangerously high. A wrestling match or strategy game could let people work out aggression or demonstrate skill in ways that brought respect rather than conflict. What's really sophisticated is how well the Vikings understood mental health maintenance. They knew people needed different types of stimulation to stay psychologically healthy, and they made sure to provide variety in both work and leisure. Some people thrived on detailed, focused work that required concentration. Weapon crafting, complex weaving, intricate carving. These provided mental engagement for people who needed that kind of challenge. Others needed more social, collaborative activities. Cooking, storytelling, group games filled that need. Still others benefited from physical activity and competition, and even in the confined space of a longhouse, they found ways to provide that. They also understood the importance of privacy and alone time. Even in communal living, people need space to process thoughts and emotions. So they developed subtle ways to provide this without actually separating people from the group. Certain work activities were understood to be solitary. Specific areas might be designated as quiet zones. These arrangements let people get mental space when they needed it while staying part of the community. But maybe the most important psychological tool was maintaining a culture of optimism and forward thinking. Winter wasn't seen as an endless ordeal to survive, but as a temporary phase that would give way to spring. They spent time planning for the coming year, discussing potential expeditions, preparing for activities that would resume when weather improved. This future focus served multiple functions. It gave people something to look forward to. It provided concrete goals to work on during winter, and it reinforced that current hardships were temporary, making them feel more bearable. The planning wasn't just wishful thinking either. It was serious preparation involving practical considerations about resources, logistics, coordination. Young people learned navigation, trading, combat techniques. Tools and equipment were prepared for future expeditions. Alliances and partnerships were discussed and negotiated. All of this kept people mentally engaged and socially connected during months that could otherwise feel meaningless and isolating. But underlying everything was a fundamental understanding about human nature that the Vikings had developed through centuries of experience with extreme conditions. They understood that people are resilient and adaptable, but only when they feel valued, connected, and hopeful. Every social structure they created was designed to nurture these feelings, even under the most challenging circumstances. So here's something that might surprise you about these Viking communities surviving months of Arctic winter. They were actually cleaner than most medieval people who lived in much more comfortable conditions. I know, right? You'd think that when you're trapped in a smoky longhouse with a bunch of people and animals for months, hygiene would be the last thing on your mind. But the Vikings figured out something crucial. Staying clean wasn't about vanity or social niceties. It was literally a matter of life and death.
Think about it this way, Mac. When you're living in super close quarters with no possibility of medical help, preventing disease and infection becomes just as critical as staying warm or well fed. One person getting seriously sick could endanger the entire community. So these people had to get creative about staying clean under conditions that seemed designed to make cleanliness impossible.
I mean, everything about Arctic winter worked against basic hygiene. Water froze solid, so you couldn't just wash normally. If you tried to wash clothes, they might never dry. Taking a regular bath could literally kill you from hypothermia. And yet somehow the Vikings managed to stay remarkably healthy and clean using techniques that were both ingenious and practical. Here's what they figured out. They couldn't do everything the way they would in summer, so they had to prioritize. Which parts of the body absolutely had to stay clean? What kinds of dirt posed the biggest health risks? This wasn't about meeting social standards of appearance. This was about preventing infections, parasites, and diseases that loved dirty conditions. Personal washing became this carefully planned activity that got maximum results while using minimum resources and cold exposure. Instead of full-body baths, which would have been dangerous and wasteful, They developed targeted cleaning techniques that kept the most important areas healthy. They used heated stones to warm small amounts of water for washing. You'd heat a stone in the fire, then drop it in a bowl of water to bring it to a comfortable temperature. This used way less fuel than heating water directly over the fire. Then they'd use that warm water efficiently, face and hands first, since those were most exposed to dirt, and most likely to transfer contamination to food or wounds. But get this, they also became experts at dry cleaning techniques. And I'm not talking about the modern chemical process. They used materials like sand, ash, and even snow to clean skin and remove oils and dirt without using precious water. Clean sand could be warmed by the fire and used to scrub hands and arms, removing grime and dead skin. Wood ash, when properly prepared, had natural soap-like qualities that could clean skin and hair. Snow, when the temperature wasn't too brutal, could be used for quick cleaning that was actually refreshing rather than dangerous. Hair care was particularly challenging, but they had solutions for that too. They used bone and antler combs daily, not just for looks, but to remove dirt, debris, and parasites. Regular combing distributed natural oils from the scalp throughout the hair, which protected it from drying out while keeping it cleaner. They also figured out natural dry shampoos. Fine ash, certain clays, even crushed grains could absorb oils and dirt from hair. You'd work it through your hair, then comb it out, leaving your hair cleaner and more manageable. These weren't desperate makeshift solutions. They were effective techniques that actually worked better than just letting hair get matted and gross. Dental hygiene was another area where they showed real innovation. They understood that tooth problems could become serious health issues when there was no dentist to call. So they developed ways to clean teeth using natural materials available even in winter. Twigs from certain trees, when chewed, would fray into natural toothbrushes that cleaned teeth effectively. Birch twigs were popular because they had antimicrobial properties and tasted decent. Salt, when they had it, was used to scrub teeth and gums. Even certain types of charcoal could clean and whiten teeth while protecting against decay. But personal hygiene was only half the battle. Keeping living spaces clean was equally important, and maybe even more challenging. The longhouse had to accommodate people, animals, food storage, and work activities while staying warm enough for survival. Keeping this complex environment clean required constant attention and clever techniques. Floor management was crucial. The longhouse floor wasn't just something to walk on, it was where food got prepared, where kids played, where spilled stuff accumulated. The Vikings learned to layer floors with materials that could be easily cleaned or replaced. Fresh rushes, straw, or sand could be spread on the floor, then swept up and replaced regularly, taking dirt and debris with it. Waste management was critical too. Human waste, food scraps, garbage. None of this could just pile up in the living space. They developed systems for collecting and removing waste that minimized odors and health risks while being practical in harsh weather. Chamber pots got emptied regularly, even when it meant going outside in terrible conditions. Waste was disposed of in designated areas far enough from living spaces to prevent contamination of water or food. These disposal sites were carefully chosen and managed to prevent problems with scavengers or disease spread. Food hygiene required constant attention. When your food stores had to last months, preventing spoilage and contamination could mean the difference between survival and starvation. They developed detailed procedures for handling, preparing, and serving food that minimized contamination while preserving quality and nutrition. Cooking areas stayed as clean as possible given the constraints. Utensils were cleaned after each use, often using heated sand or ash as abrasives. Food prep surfaces were scraped clean and sometimes treated with natural antimicrobial substances. Even the order of food preparation was planned to prevent cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods. Water management was maybe the trickiest aspect. Clean water was essential for drinking, cooking, and washing, but getting and storing clean water in freezing conditions required careful planning and technique. They learned to identify the cleanest water sources and process water to make it safer. Boiling was one option, though fuel conservation meant this couldn't be routine. Filtering through sand, charcoal, or cloth removed visible contaminants. Even just letting water settle so particles could sink was better than using obviously dirty water. Storage of clean water was equally important. Containers had to stay clean and protected from contamination. Ice was harvested from clean sources and stored properly. Melting ice or snow for water required knowing which ice was safe and which might contain harmful stuff. What's really impressive is that the Vikings understood hygiene was a community responsibility. In confined living, one person's poor hygiene could affect everyone's health. They developed social expectations and support systems that encouraged everyone to maintain cleanliness while helping people who were struggling with illness or other challenges. Kids learned hygiene practices early and were expected to help maintain clean conditions as soon as they were able. Adults monitored each other's health, offering help when problems were noticed. Elderly or sick community members got assistance with personal care that kept them clean and comfortable even when they couldn't manage these tasks alone. The result? These communities stayed remarkably healthy throughout winter. Archaeological evidence suggests Viking populations had lower disease rates and better overall health than many other medieval groups, despite living under much more challenging conditions. Their understanding of hygiene and health maintenance, combined with their other survival techniques, let them not just survive Arctic winters, but actually thrive. But you know what? All these survival strategies, fire management, food preservation, social organization, hygiene, they all depended on one fundamental thing: creating shelter systems that could protect human life during months of extreme weather. And this is where the Vikings maybe showed their greatest innovation. When most people think about shelter in extreme cold, they imagine a simple equation: build walls, add roof, cross fingers. But the Vikings who mastered winter survival understood that shelter wasn't just about keeping wind and snow out, it was about creating microclimates, managing airflow, controlling moisture, and engineering thermal dynamics using nothing but natural materials and accumulated wisdom. The longhouse that worked fine in summer had to be completely transformed for winter. This wasn't just adding insulation or banking snow around walls. It required completely reimagining how interior space could be organized to create multiple climate zones within one structure, each optimized for different activities and needs. The most sophisticated part was how they managed air circulation. Air movement is tricky in extreme cold. You need enough circulation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup from fires and manage humidity from breathing and cooking. But too much air movement means losing precious heat and creating dangerous drafts. They solved this through careful placement of small openings at different heights. Warm air rises, so they put vents near the roof that let the warmest, most humid air escape. Cool air sinks, so they managed low-level airflow to bring in fresh air without creating uncomfortable drafts. The size and placement of these openings could be adjusted based on weather and how many people were inside. But the real innovation was thermal stratification within the longhouse. Instead of trying to heat the entire space uniformly, which would have been impossible and wasteful, they created distinct thermal zones for different purposes. The area around the central hearth was the warmest zone, reserved for activities needing the most heat: cooking, metalwork, caring for sick or elderly people. Sleeping platforms were in the next zone, far enough from the fire to avoid overheating, but close enough for radiant heat. Work areas were arranged in zones with appropriate temperatures for different tasks. Storage areas were often in the coolest zones, which actually helped preserve food, while making efficient use of space that would have been too cold for human activity anyway. This zoning meant fuel was used efficiently while still providing appropriate conditions for everything necessary for survival. Moisture management was another critical aspect they mastered. When you've got multiple people breathing, cooking, and washing in an enclosed space for months, humidity becomes a serious problem. Too much moisture leads to condensation that can freeze on walls, reducing insulation and creating health hazards. Too little makes dry air that causes respiratory problems. They balanced humidity through ventilation, material choices, and strategic placement of moisture sources. Certain construction materials naturally absorbed and released moisture, buffering humidity levels. The central fire not only provided heat but created air currents that carried humid air out through roof vents. Activities that produced moisture, like cooking and washing, were positioned where resulting humidity could be managed effectively. Steam could be directed toward areas where it would condense and drain harmlessly, rather than freezing on walls or creating uncomfortable humidity in sleeping areas. Insulation went way beyond stuffing moss and animal hair into wall cavities. They understood that effective insulation required creating dead air spaces that trapped warm air while preventing heat loss. They developed sophisticated methods for creating these air spaces using available materials. Multiple wall construction was one technique. Instead of one thick wall, they'd build two thinner walls with space between them. This space could be filled with insulating materials, but more importantly, it created an air gap that dramatically reduced heat transfer. The outer wall protected insulation from weather, while the inner wall provided a warm, dry interior surface. They also used the ground as part of their insulation strategy. Rather than building on the surface, they'd excavate partially underground, taking advantage of Earth's natural insulation. The ground below the frost line maintains relatively stable temperature throughout winter, providing a foundation much warmer than the surface. Roof construction was particularly ingenious. A simple roof would lose enormous heat through convection and radiation. Viking winter roofs were complex insulation systems that trapped warm air in multiple layers while shedding rain and snow effectively. They used double roof systems. The inner roof was thin, designed primarily to support insulation and manage airflow. Above this, they built thick insulation layers using whatever was available: turf, moss, animal hair, even snow sometimes. The outer roof shed water and protected insulation from weather. This multi-layer system created thermal barriers that were remarkably effective. Insulation trapped warm air rising from below, while outer layers protected against heat loss to outside air. The result was a roof that maintained comfortable interior temperature, even when outside temperatures were life-threatening. Maybe the cleverest aspect was integrating thermal mass into their designs. Thermal mass is material that absorbs and stores heat during warm periods and releases it during cool periods, moderating temperature fluctuations. Large stones placed strategically around the hearth absorbed heat when fires burned actively during the day. These stones continued radiating heat throughout the night, maintaining comfortable temperatures even when fires were banked low to conserve fuel. Stone placement was carefully planned to maximize effectiveness while serving other purposes like supporting cooking equipment or providing work surfaces. They also learned to use thermal mass to control timing of heat distribution. By managing when and how thermal mass materials were heated, they could create heating systems that provided warmth when most needed rather than just when fires happened to be burning actively. And you know what's really impressive? They had solutions for emergency shelter too. Vikings who traveled during winter had to be ready to create effective shelter quickly, using only materials they could carry or find immediately. Snow shelters were one option, but building effective snow caves requires specific conditions and considerable skill. They developed alternative techniques that were more reliable and easier to construct. Lean-to shelters could be built quickly using minimal materials while still providing effective protection from wind and cold. They also developed portable shelter components that could be carried and assembled as needed. Lightweight framework materials, compact insulation, waterproof covers could be combined to create temporary shelters much more effective than simple tents. But the most important emergency skill was assessing and modifying existing natural shelter. A cave, rock overhang, or dense grove could be enhanced using simple techniques to create effective protection. Knowing how to recognize these opportunities and improve them quickly could mean the difference between surviving an unexpected storm and freezing to death. The psychological aspects of shelter were just as important as the physical ones. Well-designed shelter didn't just keep people alive, it made them feel secure, comfortable, and optimistic. The Vikings understood that shelter design affected morale and mental health, especially during long confinement periods. They created interior spaces that felt welcoming despite harsh conditions outside. Attention to details like lighting, air quality, and noise management made the difference between shelter that people endured and shelter they actually enjoyed living in. This wasn't luxury, it was practical psychology that maintained mental health necessary for long-term survival. But creating and maintaining these sophisticated shelter systems required something that might be even more impressive than the techniques themselves: a way to pass down complex knowledge through generations and adapt it continuously to new challenges. So here's something that really blows my mind about these Viking survival techniques. None of this stuff was written down in manuals or taught in formal classrooms. All this incredibly sophisticated knowledge about fire management, food preservation, shelter engineering, everything we've been talking about, it was all passed down through what was basically an ancient apprenticeship system mixed with family storytelling traditions. And I'm not talking about simple information transfer like, here's how you bank a fire. This was a complex cultural system that made sure survival techniques evolved and improved over time while staying reliable enough that people could literally bet their lives on them. You know how kids today learn things? They sit in classrooms, memorize facts, take tests. Viking kids learned by just being included in the activities that kept everyone alive. They didn't get lectures about fire management. They watched adults tend fires every single day, were given small jobs like gathering kindling, and slowly absorbed through participation how to read the signs that indicated when a fire needed attention. This hands-on learning was incredibly effective because it created deep, intuitive understanding rather than just book knowledge. A kid who'd spent years watching adults bank fires didn't just know the steps to follow, they understood the subtle visual cues that showed when coals were ready, the feel of different fuel types, the sound that meant proper airflow. Their knowledge was embedded in their senses and reflexes, not just stored in memory. But childhood was just the foundation. The real education happened during those long winter months when survival techniques had to be used constantly, and there was actually time for detailed instruction and practice. Winter was essentially a months-long survival school where theoretical knowledge got tested against reality and adjusted based on what actually worked. Young adults would get increasing responsibility for critical tasks, but always with supervision and backup systems. A teenager might be responsible for maintaining a fire overnight, but an experienced adult would check regularly and be ready to step in if problems developed. This graduated responsibility system built confidence and competence while minimizing the risk of dangerous mistakes. The teaching wasn't just about technical skills either. It included judgment and decision-making abilities that were often more important than knowing specific techniques. Understanding when to take risks and when to be cautious, how to assess changing conditions, how to prioritize different survival needs. These were complex skills that could only be developed through experience and mentorship. Storytelling played a huge role in this knowledge transfer system. Stories about successful survival weren't just entertainment. They were case studies that showed how different approaches worked in various situations. A story about an ancestor who survived a particularly harsh winter might include detailed descriptions of techniques used, challenges faced, and decisions that made the difference between success and failure. These stories served multiple educational functions. They preserved specific technical knowledge in memorable form. They provided models for decision-making under stress. They illustrated consequences of different choices, and they created cultural context that made survival knowledge meaningful and important rather than just practical information. But here's what's really sophisticated. The Vikings understood that survival techniques had to be adapted to changing conditions. What worked during one winter might not work the next. New challenges required new solutions. The most effective communities were those that could innovate and adapt while maintaining core knowledge that had proven reliable over generations. This balance between tradition and innovation was managed through a kind of cultural testing system. New techniques were tried carefully, often as supplements to proven methods rather than replacements. If innovations proved effective, they'd gradually be incorporated into standard approaches. If they failed, the community could fall back on traditional methods without compromising basic survival capabilities. The testing process was inherently conservative, which made sense given the stakes. But it was also systematic and thorough. Changes weren't adopted casually, but they weren't automatically rejected either. The Vikings developed ways to evaluate new approaches that maximized learning while minimizing risk. One way they did this was through redundancy. Instead of relying on a single technique for any critical survival need, they maintained multiple backup systems. This meant they could experiment with new approaches without putting the entire community at risk. If a new fire management technique failed, traditional backup methods were always available. The redundancy also meant different families could specialize in different approaches to the same challenges. One family might be known for particularly effective food preservation, while another excelled at shelter construction. This created a community knowledge base much broader and more resilient than what any individual could maintain. Knowledge sharing between communities was another important aspect of how techniques evolved and spread. When communities were isolated during winter, they relied on their own resources and knowledge. But during summer, when travel was possible, there were opportunities to learn from other groups who'd faced similar challenges. Trading expeditions, raids, and social visits weren't just economic or political activities, they were technical education opportunities. Vikings who'd developed new survival techniques could share them with other communities while learning about innovations others had developed. This cross-pollination helped ensure effective techniques spread throughout the Viking world. The knowledge sharing wasn't always formal. Sometimes it happened through casual conversations around fires or during shared meals. A visitor might mention an interesting food preservation approach they'd heard about, or demonstrate a tool design that had proven effective. These informal exchanges were often just as valuable as structured learning opportunities. But maybe the most sophisticated aspect of Viking knowledge management was how they dealt with failure and disaster. When survival techniques failed, either partially or completely, the community didn't just suffer the consequences and move on. They analyzed what had gone wrong, why it had happened, and what could be done differently in the future. This failure analysis was crucial for improving techniques over time. It identified weaknesses in existing approaches, revealed circumstances requiring different strategies, and generated ideas for innovations that might prevent similar problems. Knowledge gained from failures was just as valuable as knowledge from successes, and it was preserved and shared just as carefully. They also developed ways to simulate and practice survival techniques during non-emergency situations, letting them identify potential problems before they became life-threatening. Young people might practice building emergency shelters during summer when failure would be uncomfortable but not dangerous. Families might test food preservation techniques on small batches before committing their entire winter supply to a particular method. This practice approach served multiple purposes. It provided safe opportunities to develop skills and test innovations. It identified problems that could be corrected before becoming critical, and it maintained skills that might not be needed regularly but could be crucial during emergencies. The timing of knowledge transfer was also carefully managed. Different types of survival knowledge were taught at different times of year when relevant techniques were actually being used. Food preservation was taught during harvest season when foods were being processed for winter storage. Shelter construction was taught during building season when longhouses were being prepared for winter. This seasonal timing made education more relevant and immediate. People learned techniques when they could immediately apply them, improving retention and understanding. It also meant instruction could be integrated with actual survival activities rather than being separate, abstract lessons. But the most important aspect of Viking knowledge management was understanding that survival skills were never truly mastered. Even the most experienced individuals continued learning and improving throughout their lives. Conditions changed, new challenges arose, and techniques that had worked well for years might suddenly prove inadequate. This recognition created a culture of continuous learning and improvement. People remained open to new ideas throughout their lives. They understood that expertise meant not knowing all the answers, but knowing how to find answers and adapt to changing circumstances. The result was a remarkably resilient survival culture that could maintain complex techniques across generations while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The knowledge that allowed Vikings to thrive during Arctic winters wasn't static information. It was a living, evolving system that grew stronger over time. But you know what I think is the most remarkable thing about all these techniques and knowledge systems? They all served a single, deeper purpose that went beyond just physical survival. They were about maintaining hope during the darkest months of the year. See, in the depths of Arctic winter, when the sun had been gone for weeks with weeks more ahead, when fuel was running low and food stores were dwindling, when the cold outside could kill in minutes and darkness seemed to press against the walls like something alive, the most important survival skill wasn't technical at all. It was the ability to maintain hope, not the bright, energetic optimism of summer, but something quieter and more durable. The steady belief that spring would return, that current hardship was temporary, and that the effort required to survive was worthwhile. This wasn't just a nice philosophical idea, it was practical necessity. People who lost hope during winter often stopped taking care of themselves and their responsibilities. They became careless with fire management, neglected food preparation, withdrew from community activities, and sometimes simply gave up on daily tasks that kept everyone alive. In extreme conditions, despair could be just as deadly as cold or hunger. The Vikings understood this instinctively, and they developed remarkably sophisticated techniques for maintaining psychological resilience during months of hardship. These weren't just individual coping strategies. They were community-wide systems for preserving mental health and maintaining motivation necessary for long-term survival. The foundation was something modern psychology would recognize as cognitive reframing. The Vikings didn't see winter as suffering to be endured. They saw it as opportunity, preparation, even celebration. This wasn't denial or self-deception, it was a deliberate choice to focus on positive aspects rather than dwelling on hardships. Winter was when the most beautiful crafts were created, when important stories were told, when families grew closer through shared challenges, when young people learned skills that would serve them throughout life. The same months that could be seen as imprisonment could also be seen as retreat from outside demands and distractions. Time for reflection, creativity, and deep connection with family and community. This reframing was reinforced through daily practices and rituals that emphasized the value and meaning of winter activities. Work wasn't just busy work to pass time, it was preparation for future success and contribution to family welfare. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were education and cultural preservation. Games weren't just distraction, they were skill development and community building. But maybe the most powerful technique for maintaining hope during Arctic winters was the ability to maintain hope, not the bright, energetic optimism of summer, but something quieter and more durable. The Vikings understood this instinctively, and they developed remarkably sophisticated techniques for maintaining psychological resilience during months of hardship. These weren't just individual coping strategies. They were community-wide systems for preserving mental health and maintaining motivation necessary for long-term survival. The was how Vikings managed their relationship with time during winter months. The lack of normal daylight cycles could make time feel endless and shapeless, which was psychologically exhausting. People could lose track of how long winter had been and how much longer it might continue, making the experience feel overwhelming and interminable. The Vikings solved this through careful timekeeping and creation of meaningful milestones throughout winter. They didn't just mark passage of days, they created structure of observances, celebrations, and achievements that broke long winter into manageable segments and provided regular opportunities for hope and renewal. The winter solstice was particularly important. Rather than being seen as the darkest point of a dark season, it was celebrated as the turning point when days would begin growing longer. This wasn't just symbolic, it was practical psychology. Even though the coldest months lay ahead, the solstice provided concrete evidence that winter wasn't eternal, that change was happening, and that progress towards spring had begun. Other milestones were created throughout winter to provide regular reminders of progress and hope. Completion of major craft projects was celebrated. The halfway point of food stores was marked as achievement rather than crisis. The first barely perceptible lengthening of days was noted and discussed. These observances created a sense of forward movement even during months when external conditions remained harsh and unchanging. The Vikings also understood the importance of maintaining connections to the natural world during months when nature seemed hostile. Rather than retreating completely into artificial indoor environments, they found ways to stay connected to natural rhythms that reminded them of their place in larger patterns of change and renewal. They paid attention to subtle changes in weather patterns, noting when storms began shifting in character or when daylight quality began changing. They watched for signs of animal activity indicating changing seasons. They observed moon phases and star movement. These observations weren't just scientific interest, they were psychological anchors, connecting people to natural cycles of change and renewal. Ritual and ceremony played crucial roles in maintaining hope. The Vikings created formal observances that marked important transitions and provided opportunities for collective expression of faith in the future. These ceremonies weren't just religious activities, they were community therapy sessions addressing psychological challenges of winter survival. Feasting, when food supplies allowed, served this function beautifully. A winter feast wasn't just a meal, it was demonstration of abundance, celebration of community success, and expression of confidence in the future. The decision to use precious food stores for celebration rather than just survival was a powerful statement of faith that there would be enough, that the community would survive, and that life was worth celebrating even under difficult circumstances. Music and singing played similar roles. Group singing created emotional connection and shared experience that counteracted isolation that could develop during long confinement. The songs themselves often reinforced themes of resilience, hope, and eventual triumph. And making music together created immediate pleasure and beauty that reminded people life included joy as well as hardship. Physical activity and challenge were also important for maintaining mental health during confinement. Even in limited space of winter quarters, they found ways to provide opportunities for physical exertion and competition that helped people manage stress and maintain condition. Wrestling matches, strength competitions, skill contests provided outlets for physical energy and competitive drive that might otherwise have turned into interpersonal conflict. These activities also created opportunities for achievement and recognition that helped people maintain self-esteem and social status during months when normal activities weren't possible. Games of strategy and skill served similar functions for mental stimulation. Board games, riddles, competitions of wit provided intellectual engagement that prevented mental stagnation during long periods of routine activity. These games also created social interaction and mild competition that enlivened daily life without creating serious conflict. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings maintained hope through planning and preparation for future activities. Winter wasn't seen as an endpoint, but as preparation for activities that would resume when conditions improved. Tools were repaired for future use, trade goods were crafted for future exchanges, skills were developed that would be valuable in future endeavors. This future orientation served multiple psychological functions. It created concrete goals, providing meaning and motivation for current activities. It reinforced the temporary nature of current hardships, and it maintained a sense of agency and control that was crucial for psychological well-being. But underlying all these specific techniques was a fundamental attitude that made Viking winter survival possible. It was understanding that hardship and comfort, challenge and ease, winter and summer were all part of natural cycles that gave life meaning and depth. Difficult months weren't obstacles to a good life. They were essential components of a complete life. This perspective allowed people to find genuine satisfaction and meaning in winter months, rather than just enduring them. Challenges became opportunities for growth and demonstration of character. Community bonds formed during shared hardships became sources of strength and connection. Skills developed during winter became foundations for future success and confidence. As spring finally approached and first hints of returning light appeared on the horizon, Vikings who'd successfully weathered another winter weren't just relieved survivors. They were people who'd been transformed by their experience, who'd proven their capabilities to themselves and their community, and who'd maintained connection to sources of meaning and hope that made life worthwhile, even under the most challenging circumstances. The techniques they'd developed for surviving Arctic nights that lasted months weren't just survival skills. They were wisdom about how to live well under any circumstances, how to find meaning and joy even during difficult times, and how to maintain human connections and spiritual resources that make survival worthwhile. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing about these Viking secrets. They weren't just about staying alive during impossible conditions. They were about staying fully human, fully connected, and fully hopeful, no matter what challenges life might bring. You know, as we come to the end of our journey through these long Arctic nights of the past, I can't help but think about what these remarkable people really accomplished. And it's not just that they survived conditions that would probably defeat most of us today, even with all our modern gear and technology. It's that they figured out how to do something much harder than just surviving. They learned how to thrive. Think about it this way. These Vikings didn't have central heating, electric lights, grocery stores, or any of the things we consider essential for getting through a rough winter. What they had was something both simpler and more profound. They had generations of accumulated wisdom from people who'd faced the same challenges and kept refining their responses through centuries of trial and error. But more than that, they had communities that understood there's a difference between just making it through winter and actually using winter as an opportunity to grow stronger. And they chose to pursue that harder path, even when it would have been easier to just hunker down and wait for spring. The techniques we've talked about tonight weren't random survival tricks that happened to work. They were integrated systems that addressed every aspect of human need during extreme conditions. Physical needs like warmth and nutrition, obviously, but also social needs like connection and purpose, psychological needs like hope and meaning, and spiritual needs like feeling connected to something larger than just immediate circumstances. Each individual technique was impressive on its own. The fire management that could maintain steady heat for months using minimal fuel. The food preservation that kept people well nourished on stuff that had been stored for half a year. The shelter designs that created comfortable living spaces in the middle of frozen wastelands. The social structures that let dozens of people live together peacefully in confined spaces for months. But what made these techniques truly remarkable was how they all worked together. The same central hearth that provided heat also became the focal point for social activities and the place where food got prepared. The same storytelling traditions that provided entertainment also served as education, cultural preservation, and basically group therapy. The same work activities that produced necessary goods also created opportunities for skill development, social interaction, and personal achievement. This integration meant Vikings didn't just survive winter. They used winter as a chance to strengthen their communities, develop their capabilities, and deepen their understanding of themselves and their world. The months that could have been seen as lost time became some of the most productive and meaningful periods of the year. And here's something I find even more impressive: the sustainability of these systems. The Vikings weren't just getting through one difficult winter. They were creating approaches that could be repeated year after year, generation after generation, without burning out resources or breaking down under stress. Their techniques actually got better over time, becoming more sophisticated and effective as knowledge accumulated and innovations were tested. This sustainability wasn't accidental. It was built into every aspect of their approach. They used renewable resources whenever possible. They developed techniques that strengthened rather than weakened their communities. They created knowledge preservation systems that ensured valuable insights wouldn't be lost. And they maintained the flexibility and adaptability that let them respond to changing conditions and new challenges. The psychological sustainability was just as important as the physical sustainability. The Vikings developed approaches to winter survival that people could actually maintain mentally over multiple years. They didn't just grit their teeth and endure hardship. They found ways to make hardship meaningful and even enjoyable. This meant people could face each winter with confidence and anticipation rather than dread and despair. You know what's interesting? Modern survival experts often focus on the technical aspects of staying alive in extreme conditions. Equipment, techniques, procedures that can keep people functioning until rescue arrives or conditions improve. But the Vikings were dealing with situations where rescue wasn't coming and conditions wouldn't improve for months. They had to create solutions that people could actually live with, not just survive with. This long-term perspective changed everything about how they approached survival challenges. Short-term solutions that depleted resources or damaged morale weren't acceptable, even if they provided immediate relief. Every technique had to contribute to overall well-being and community resilience, not just address immediate problems. The result was an approach to extreme conditions that was remarkably sophisticated and effective. Archaeological evidence suggests Viking communities didn't just survive these challenging winters, they actually thrived during them. Population levels remained stable or grew, craft production continued at high levels, cultural development and innovation kept happening, and communities emerged from winter months stronger and more connected than when they entered them. But I think the most valuable lesson from these Viking survival techniques isn't really about how to handle Arctic conditions. It's about how to approach any challenging situation with wisdom, resourcefulness, and community support. The principles that allowed Vikings to thrive during months of darkness and cold are principles that can help anyone deal with difficult circumstances. The importance of preparation and planning, the value of community cooperation and mutual support, the need to find meaning and purpose even during hardship, the wisdom of maintaining hope and focusing on future possibilities rather than getting stuck on present difficulties, the understanding that challenges can become opportunities for growth and development if you approach them with the right mindset. These aren't just survival principles, they're life principles that remain relevant regardless of what specific challenges we face. Whether you're dealing with job loss, illness, relationship problems, or any of the other difficulties life throws at us, the Viking approach offers valuable insights into how to not just endure hardship, but actually grow from it. The Vikings understood something we sometimes forget in our comfortable modern world. Ease and convenience, while pleasant, aren't what make life meaningful or fulfilling. It's the challenges we overcome, the skills we develop, the relationships we build, and the contributions we make that give life depth and significance. The Arctic winters that could have destroyed these communities instead became the crucible that forged some of the most resilient and successful societies in history. Their success didn't come from magic or some special toughness that we lack today. It came from practical wisdom, careful planning, community cooperation, and a relentless commitment to not just surviving, but finding ways to flourish under any circumstances. Whether that meant sleeping next to livestock for warmth, eating fermented fish that would challenge modern palates, or maintaining social harmony in impossibly cramped conditions, they did whatever it took and they did it together. As you settle in for the night, maybe you can take some comfort in knowing that humans are capable of remarkable adaptation and resilience when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. The same creativity, cooperation, and determination that allowed Vikings to turn months of darkness into seasons of growth exists within all of us. We may not face Arctic winters, but we all encounter difficulties that test our resources and resolve. The next time you're confronted with a challenge that seems overwhelming, remember these remarkable people who transformed survival into thriving, who proved that human ingenuity and community spirit can overcome even the most hostile conditions. Their specific techniques may have been designed for extreme cold and darkness, but their underlying wisdom is timeless and universal. So as the warmth of your own shelter surrounds you tonight, and the promise of tomorrow's dawn waits just hours away, let your mind drift peacefully towards sleep. Maybe you'll dream of the quiet strength and enduring hope that carried our ancestors through their longest, darkest nights and into the light of countless springs. And who knows, maybe you'll wake up tomorrow with a little more confidence in your own ability to weather whatever storms life might bring your way. Because if they could thrive in conditions that would challenge our best modern technology, using nothing but natural materials and accumulated wisdom, imagine what you might be capable of with all the resources and knowledge available to you today. The Vikings proved that winter, literal or metaphorical, doesn't have to be something that happens to you. It can be something you use to become stronger, wiser, and more connected to the people and purposes that matter most, and that might be the most valuable secret of all. Sweet dreams, my friend. May your rest be as peaceful as a well-banked fire, and may you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever adventures tomorrow might bring.